Lesson 3, NFS data stores. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe NFS components, describe the differences between NFS version 3 and NFS version 4.1, and configure and manage NFS data stores. NFS components. An NFS file system is located on a NAS device that is called the NFS server. The NFS server contains one or more directories that are shared with the ESXi host over an IP network. An ESXi host accesses the NFS server through a VM kernel port that is defined on the virtual switch. So let's say we have an NFS server and it's got our storage on it. We export or share, let's say this ISO data store. It goes over the IP network. We can see it's 192.168.81.33, and we have a VM kernel port configured with 192.168.81.72. So it basically just goes over the network and picks up the file share from the ESXi host. Now it will mount it on the ESXi host as a folder or as a data. It looks like a data store, but it's an NFS data store. Configuring an NFS data store. So you create a VM kernel port on a virtual switch that has access to the same network as your NAS device. For better performance and security, you'd want to put it on a separate network from the iSCSI network. Or some cases nowadays you don't even use iSCSI, they recommend NFS, so maybe put your NFS on a completely separate network by itself. You provide the following information, whether you want it to be version 3 or 4.1 of NFS, the server or IP address of the NFS server you're connecting to, and then you have to give it the folder. For example, if you're sharing templates folder, NFS share, that'll be on there. The host to create the data store on, so you do it from whatever host in your ESXi cluster, and whether to mount the NFS file system read-only or not. That's a checkbox. If you want it to be read-only, you can check it. If it's like an ISO folder, or it may be something, generally for ISOs, you don't want anybody to delete the ISOs, you would check it as read-only. That's the only real world scenario I'd see you wanting it read-only. You give then give the data store name, what you want it to look like on the ESXi host, and then any kind of authentication parameters that you would have to give it to access that NFS storage. NFS version 3 and NFS version 4.1. In NFS version 3, ESXi managed the multipathing, off-sys root authentication, had VMware proprietary file locking, and had client-side error tracking. NFS 4.1 has native multipathing and session trunking, has optional Kerberos authentication, has built-in file locking, and uses server-side error tracking. NFS version compatibility with other vSphere technologies. As we can see, the only thing is the DRS and vSphere storage IO control is not compatible with 4.1. It's not compatible with Site Recovery Manager, and it's not compatible with the new virtual volumes. Okay, this slide doesn't match what's in the book, but it's still the same idea. They just got it named a little different in the slide here. But the NFS dual stack not supported. NFS data store best practices. Again, NFS version 3 locking is not compatible with NFS version 4.1. So again, I think in an earlier slide I said I've read stuff that says it's not a good idea to run 4.1 and 3. They recommend using either one or the other for all your hosts, and this is why, because the locking's not compatible. The best practice is to configure an NFS array to allow only one NFS protocol. Also use either NFS3 or NFS4 1 to mount the same NFS share across all ESXi hosts, so don't mix the protocols across hosts. Mounting an NFS share as NFS3 on one host and as NFS4 on a 4.1 on another host can lead to data corruption. So like I've been saying, keep all your versions the same. If you want to go all 4.1, do it, but do it to all hosts. And if you want to go with version 3, do it with all hosts. NFS data store name and configuration. Here's where you give it the data store name you want to show up on the ESXi host. That's the folder that's on the NFS device, the server name. And here's that checkbox if you want to mark it as read-only or not. And then we'll move to next. You can configure Active Directory and NFS servers to use Kerberos. Before enabling Kerberos on ESXi host, create an account in Active Directory for NFS 4.1 access. You enable Kerberos DES encryption, and as you can see in this picture they have to the side here, when you create that account for your NFS user, you check this box right here. It says use Kerberos not triple DES, but just DES encryption types for this host. Set the account to never expire. You then configure the NFS servers to use Kerberos, and then configure NFS server shares to grant full access to the Active Directory account used. Configuring host authentication and NFS Kerberos credentials. After you've enabled your Active Directory account, in each ESXi host, you'll add them to the domain. So we'll join our ESXi host to the domain. And then NFS Kerberos credentials section, we'll edit it and we'll put our information in there that we created in Active Directory. Implications of using NFS Kerberos. Be aware of all the UID and GID on the files. For NFS version 3, these will be root. Accessing files created with NFS version 3 from the NFS version 4.1 Kerberos client will result in permission denied errors. Use the same Active Directory user on all ESXi hosts. So as we've seen earlier, we create an NFS user, use that on all your ESXi hosts. vSphere, vMotion, and other features might fail if the individual hosts use different user accounts, and use host profiles to automate and avoid errors. Your time must be synchronized. Time synchronization is required for successful Kerberos authentication, and configure all components to synchronize to a common NTP server. And Kerberos must be configured on the NFS servers and the ESXi host before creating an NFS data store to use Kerberos authentication. Configuring the data store to use Kerberos. Back to where after we've given it the name configuration, our next step is configure Kerberos. We just check that to enable Kerberos-based authentication. Viewing IP storage information. You can view details of VMFS or NFS. As you can see on the tabs up here, you go to related objects. We have the submenu. Click on data stores and it'll show us all the data stores. Unmounting an NFS data store. You can unmount an NFS data store, but you need to stop all the virtual machines on that server or ESXi host of any virtual machines that reside on that NFS data store, and you just right click on it, do all vCenter actions, and then click on unmount data store. Now this will keep the data store, all the files will be there, it's just going to become unavailable to that host. Multipathing and NFS storage. One recommended configuration for multipathing on NFS is you configure one VM kernel port. You use adapters attached to the same physical switch. So these two NICs, excuse me, wrong way, right here. And these will be on the same virtual switch with a VM kernel bound to that, or that exists in that switch. You configure the NFS server with multiple IPs. So we have IPs here. And IP addresses cannot, or can be on the same subnet, of course. So this guy, to use multiple uplinks, configure NIC teams using the IP hash load balancing policy. So we'll have two different IPs on the same subnet from our NFS server, but these from our ESXi host will go on the same virtual switch that has one VM kernel, which will be one IP. But using these two links, it will split across to each one of the IPs. Enabling session trunking and multipathing. NFS 4.1 supports native multipathing and session trunking. To enable multipathing, you enter multiple server IPs when configuring the address. So right here, where we're putting in the IP, our NAS server will have two IP addresses, our NFS server, excuse me, and we'll separate it with commas. You should now be able to describe NFS components, describe the differences between NFS 3 and NFS 4.1, and configure and manage NFS data stores.